Hello, I'm Andrew Suskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based in West Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictions. Welcome to our podcast, which I call It's Not About the Sex, also the title of my recent book. Here we focus on all topics related to compulsive sexual behavior, often referred to as sex addiction. In particular, we explore ways to build long-term, sustainable recovery while establishing more meaningful connection and greater intimacy. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints, brand new perspectives, and practical user-friendly tools toward living a more deeply connected life. Let's get started. Today, I am super excited to have my colleague and friend, Roby Abeles, with us, all the way from Sydney, Australia. And Roby is really one of the inspirations in my brain spotting training and in my brain spotting life. And I'm just so pleased that you could be with us today. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
It's terrific. And when I see you, even at this distance, I feel like we are right next door here. But the wonders of technology have brought us together today. So I'm very grateful for that. So
The upside of Zoom.
that's right. That's right. We're so fortunate. I mean, a few years ago, it wouldn't even be possible to do such a thing. So here we are.
Yes.
So
Yes.
to get started today, I thought we would start with some basic ideas around addiction. Okay, since
Yeah.
most of our listeners are here listening to us because of their addictive compulsive behaviors, maybe from their past or maybe current, and there's such myths and misconceptions out there. And I was wondering if we could spend a moment talking about addiction in terms of why people can't stop, why there's such a difficulty stopping. Is it a lack of willpower?
Look, Andrew, I think that's the million-dollar question, is why can't people stop once they start? And I think what's not understood is that there are certain chemical reactions happening in people's brain when they ingest substances that create the need to have more of the substance. And it's nothing to do with willpower. And unfortunately, a lot of treatment for addiction in the past has gone on the assumption that it is willpower that's needed, and then people relapse. So that's a basic misunderstanding of the neuroscience of what's happening inside the brain of the addicted person.
The word neuroscience is exciting to me and at the same time overwhelms me in some ways. But I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about what you mean by the neuroscience of what we're learning.
When someone is in craving, so for any behavior, and it doesn't need to be methamphetamines or sex, it could be working or sugar or any compulsive behavior that they're sort of stuck in. When they're in the craving or the desire to move towards that behavior, a part of the brain that holds the consequences, the negative consequences for that, is completely out of their capacity to connect to. So when they want to smoke a cigarette, for example, or act out sexually or get drunk, the part of the brain that holds the consequences, the negative consequences, are completely blocked off from them. It's like a huge steel door slams shut. And all the reasons why the diabetic shouldn't be having that sugar is not available to them in that moment. And I think that if you have had that experience yourself where you may have wanted that piece of chocolate cake, or you may have wanted that one more thing, or stay at work another 2 hours, you just can't drag yourself away. It's only once you have left that or satiated that desire that you remember all your consequences and why this was something that you're trying not to do. So there are different parts of the brain that are operating in opposition to each other. And that's part of what we have to consider when we're trying to help people stop their addictive behaviors.
Thank you for sharing that in a user-friendly way, first of all. And I'm wondering if you agree with the idea that the brain gets hijacked, because I think sometimes people will talk about the hijacking of the brain. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, I think hijacking's one word for it for sure. Um, it's the human brain seeks reward. So we are pleasure and reward seeking species. So our brain wants us to have more of things that we have um, labeled good or rewarding or nice or fun. So even to the detriment of other parts of our brain, which say that's actually really bad for you. So this is the same system I was just talking about, is that when one part of your brain wants a certain reward, another part of it's sort of like the good angel on your shoulder and the little devil on your shoulder. That's kind of what's happening in your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So that the little angel on your shoulder is saying, no, no, this is really not good for you. This is going to ruin your life. And the little devil on your shoulder is saying, oh, she's ridiculous. Don't listen to that. Just one more won't hurt. It'll be different this time. So it is a kind of hijacking by these different parts of the brain. And the one that wins usually is the one that steers you towards more of the reward.
Sure.
The one that says no loses most of the time. It's not
Right.
as powerful.
Right. So we are pleasure-seeking creatures, and sometimes it can lead to dangerous consequences, and sometimes it can lead to very beautiful, fortifying experiences. But what I would like to know as we're talking about this is that we're really looking at the complexities of addiction, right?
Yes.
And so nowadays we don't look at addiction in a vacuum anymore.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you can speak more to how we see addiction and how we're how that relates to the approach to healing and recovery.
So we used to see addiction more as sort of just arising out of a vacuum, sort of like, cancer. It just happened to you one day, without any predisposing events that we could tie to it. So there was a study done by Kaiser Permanente Insurance Company in the United States. They wanted to know if they could predict who in their insured clients, could they predict who would later get serious health conditions, mental health conditions, and physical health conditions. And they interviewed 17,000 of their insured members. And what they found out was mind blowing to the medical industry and also to the addiction world. What they found was the more bad, basically, to put it in very simple language, the more situations that happened to you as a child before the age of 18 that were out of your control and that were disturbing to you in some way, the more of those you had, the higher the likelihood you would have physical health and mental health and addiction issues after the age of 18. Very high correlation. So there was a study, and it was only 10 questions, and it was sort of what happened in your home before you turned 18. And it included all different things about different types of abuse. It included the mental health status of your parents, whether or not your parents were divorced, whether or not someone was incarcerated, those kinds of things. We know now that people who answered 4 out of 10 as a yes answer to those questions have at least a 4 times greater chance of becoming an addict of some type after the age of 18.
Hmm.
So we didn't used to see this correlation,
Hmm.
that there's something in the past that's triggering the need for the person to somehow manage how they feel internally, emotionally, and mentally.
Hmm. So now we're in the ballpark of looking at addiction and trauma.
Yes, they are inseparable.
correct. And it's so interesting because you and I know that 20, 25 years ago, nobody put it all together. It seems like it's just newer
Right.
information that's now common. But
Yes.
I wanted to talk about brain spotting because I think that's what our
Yep.
listeners are here to understand today, because brain spotting is one of those approaches to trauma, or really to anything that's too much to process at the time,
Yes.
that happens to us and gets stored. And I'm wondering if you could share an overview of what brain spotting means to you, or how you would describe it to the average person.
So I think the way I understand it, and I have to explain it to myself as an average person because I'm not very good with big, fancy words. But um, basically, what happens in your brain is you have the capacity to heal yourself on many levels. So, a simple explanation would be if you get a splinter in your finger, because you catch it on something wood and you get a little piece of wooden splinter in your finger, and your body somehow, by it scanning itself, it finds that there's something in your body that shouldn't be there, and it works to push out that splinter and then heal over that little access spot so that you can never find, like, where that splinter was a couple of weeks later. You forget, you can't see, there's no scar, nothing. So what we're seeing now is that the brain has the same capacity to do that with anything in the brain that is held there, in unhealed form, just like that splinter in your finger. So that given the right conditions, which is brain spotting accesses, your brain can find that little splinter in your brain and do the healing work, that it's very well equipped to do, without overwhelming the person in the process of doing that. Is that understandable?
No, that's absolutely. I'm wondering if we can add some context,
Okay.
because I think all of us who have entered into the brain spotting community, and if I didn't say this before, Robbie is an international brain spotting trainer, and specifically does a lot of trainings around addictions. And so I'm wondering, Robbie, how you heard about brain spotting, and what about it really attracted you?
I heard about brain spotting when I went to an EMDR conference in Montreal in Canada. So EMDR is another therapy that was developed to help people resolve trauma. And there was a trainer, EMDR trainer there, David Grand from New York, who I knew well. And he was talking a little bit about brain spotting to me. And I asked him to explain brain spotting to me in about 2 sentences. And once you know what brain spotting is, you realize what a ridiculous question I asked him. You can't really explain brain spotting in 2 sentences. So he said to me, look, why don't I just give you a session right here, right now, in the middle of the products hall at this EMDR conference? So I was like, yeah, sure, okay. It was kind of like the end day of the conference, and I had sort of made a nice connection with a fellow there who I quite liked and was hoping that would turn into something later. And and David Grant said to me, so when think of an issue you want to work on, and you don't have to tell me what it is. So that's another one of the beautiful things about brain spotting, is that if you've told your story so many times to a therapist and you cannot stand the idea of having to say the story all again, you don't need to tell anything about the story to your therapist. So, because all the information is in my brain, I know all the context, I know all the stories. And so we know now all that's important is that the information is inside the client. So, David asked me and I thought, well, what will I work on? So, I'm an adopted person and have worked on my abandonment issues for, at that point, like 30 years or whatever it was. And thought, okay, I'll work on my abandonment issue. But when I first told this story, I forgot to say that I had worked on it for about 20 to 30 years prior.
Hmm.
Anyway, so David said, where in your body do you feel any sort of anything when you think about your abandonment issue? And I think it was like a pressure in my chest. And then he helped me find an eye position, so a spot in my visual field, that when I looked at that specific spot, the feeling in my chest became even more intense, so that I felt that there was a connection between that eye position and the somatic, the physical feeling in my chest, this gripping in my chest. So he just said, just keep looking there, just notice what comes and goes in your mind, and I'll check back in with you in a little bit. Anyway, so this fellow kept walking between me and this eye position, this spot on the wall opposite, and we were supposed to go to dinner afterwards. So, and he had no idea what I was doing, because I'd just sort of plonked myself down on this chair, and he's waiting to go to dinner, and I'm staring at a wall, ignoring him. So, with David sort of wandering backwards and forwards, asking me what I'm noticing now, and keep going. Anyway, so the conference wrapped up and I had to leave, and I went to dinner with this fellow. And we're coming back to the hotel in the taxi, and I had invited him to Australia for Christmas and said, why don't you come for Christmas? It's a beautiful time of year. It's our summer, as you know. It'll be fun. Anyway, so in the taxi on the way back to the hotel, he says, oh, Robbie, by the way, I won't be coming to Sydney for Christmas. And I'm like, oh, I'm sort of, doing the thing with the dog putting its head on the side going, not understand. And he said, oh, because I have a partner back home. So, yeah, Andrew's making a face of like,
I'm sad.
Yeah. So we've all sort of, well, maybe not all of us, but many of us have had that experience. So and I felt disappointed and a bit irritated that he had not mentioned this. And when I got out of the car, I thought, oh my God, normally I would have gone into an abyss of darkness and crying.
Oh.
And like, oh my God, like, so. But it was, and I thought, I've just had like a level 2 reaction to a level 2 event, which I'd never been able to have before.
Wow.
So, and I had done a lot of work previously, but this seemed to be like the thing that really wrapped it up in my brain in a way that was really adaptive. And I now respond to these things like someone who did never have an abandonment issue. And I find that extraordinary. I've been a therapist for over 35 years, and this was impossible to get to with people. People would come for these issues and we would work really hard and it would get somewhat better, but not all the way resolved. So I called David and said, when are you teaching this? I'm hooked. And he had one coming up in about 2 weeks in Chicago, and this was in 2004. So I've been doing Brainspotting since this is my 17th year.
I never heard that story. That's fantastic. Yeah. What I want to emphasize is that David Grand is the founder of Brainspotting. He has trained brain spotters on every continent and dozens and dozens and dozens of countries.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful door that you described, because on a personal level in your nervous system, you had an opportunity to experience brain spotting from the developer of brain spotting. And the part that I think is so important to highlight is that your response to the gentleman who had a partner at home was proportional to what happened, rather than some heavy-duty, overwhelming, historical kind of
hysterical.
Historical and hysterical, exactly. So... Wow.
Yes, and because really like nothing other than what was happening in my mind where this could have gone had happened with this person. Like it was so nothing.
Yeah.
But in the past, I really would have gone into, sobbing that this didn't work out.
Right. Right.
Um,
So you knew that this was a very different response that you were having.
yeah,
And it was so exciting that obviously you contacted David and eventually became a trainer
yes,
yourself.
and
So
here we are.
here we are. That's right. A few years later
The other
and
the other part of the question you asked me is, what about it other than, so that's my personal experience,
sure.
right? So then there's like a professional experience, which
Hmm.
is um, part of the story that we tell when we teach brain spotting is about David's client, who David Grand, the developer of brain spotting, has a lot of people in his practice who are elite athletes and entertainers. So he does like high performance work with people, performance expansion work. And he had a young lady who was an ice skater and professional ice skater. And he had done over a year and a half of EMDR, his specific way of using EMDR with athletes, with this young lady, and she could not land what's called a triple loop. So apparently, a triple loop is something that you have to put into every performance that you do. It's sort of a fairly basic jump. She could do things much, much more challenging, but that one she would always mess it up. So David Grand had spoken to Peter Levine, who developed somatic experiencing, which is a beautiful body oriented therapy also to help heal with shock trauma. So Peter Levine had said to David, because in EMDR, people's eyes follow like moving fingers in front of their face. And Peter Levine said to David, you have to slow that down. That's way too fast for the body to be able to keep tracking. And David moved his hand slower, and Peter said, no, slower still, almost not moving, or even not moving. So David was doing an EMDR session with this young ice skater, and he's sort of moving his two fingers across her field of vision at eye level while she's thinking of something that was disturbing for her. And all of a sudden, he saw her eyes wobble and then stare straight ahead. And the true story, which you're getting, is that he felt something grab his wrist and stop his hand from moving, so that it was a stationary eye position that this young lady was looking at rather than one that was moving even slowly. So it was completely fixed eye position. And in the next half an hour, all these trauma memories that had never come up before in her EMDR sessions with David, who was an incredibly good EMDR therapist, um, everything that they had gotten down to like zero activation now. When I think of that thing, it feels fine for me now. Those things came up and reopened, these images reopened, and there was more unprocessed emotional material underneath what they had finished in sessions previously. So that under the zero, which means when I think of that, I feel neutral now. There were these underlying other zeros, sort of like the iceberg in the water. So I was fascinated because in EMDR, I was an EMDR therapist also. We would stop at that first zero, I feel fine, everything's neutral. With brain spotting, we keep going because we do like a proper house cleaning. So apparently it goes into all the corners and cobwebs and everything and gets it all until you get a really so completely non-triggered anymore, neutral when I think of that issue. And it went far deeper than anything that EMDR had been able to do with my clients. So I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. This was incredible.
That's fantastic. I want to remind our listeners that it's not easy to describe brain spotting in words. And David Grand has a very informative website that has videos and a lot of information. It's simply www.brainspotting.com. So that would be one way of actually getting a better sense of what it actually looks like. But I think your examples, both the personal example, Robbie, and then the one with the figure skater is so great. What I would like to segue toward is your desire and passion around addictions and around what you call the crocodile setup, which is something that I trained with Robbie in. We're going to, in a few minutes, we're going to be talking about the crocodile in a very, very concentrated way. I spent a weekend with Robbie as my teacher, and then I've still been practicing it and learning it and expanding upon it. So, Robbie, in whatever way feels right to you, if you can talk about how you decided to develop this particular approach and how it helps those who are dealing with addictive compulsive issues.
I had a client who was in recovery from his drug and alcohol addiction, but every 6 years he would relapse. So he had come to me, he had had 6 years in a relapse, 6 years clean and sober, another relapse, 6 years clean and sober, and then he came to see me. And he wanted to not relapse again, which had been his pattern. And what he was doing was he was in a 12-step program. And what he was doing was sexting newcomer women to the meetings. And his wife knew about it and she was furious. And he told me a story about how she had come into his bathroom, which was all glass, the shower. He was in the shower. And she had slammed his phone into the glass of the shower, luckily not breaking it, where there was another text message that she had found. And he said, yes, I felt very vulnerable naked in that glass shower with my wife screaming. And I said, so, okay, so then he wanted to work on this sexting. And I said to him, well, what are the consequences for you? And he said, no, Robbie, I don't have consequences. My wife doesn't like it. And I thought, well, that's fascinating because he's just told me a story about how vulnerable he felt, yet he doesn't see that as a consequence. So I said to him, and I'd worked with him on some other issues, and I said to him, would you help me work out with Brainspotting a way to connect in your brain this behavior that you're doing to your consequences? Because I had the idea that there were two separate islands in his brain that were not talking to one another when they should be. And so he helped me figure out this, what we came to call the crocodile setup. I started using the metaphor of a crocodile for the addiction. Oops. Because the crocodile is a predator and an ambush hunter and slowly watches people and watches patterns so that it can have a plan of attack and know where you are going to be before you get there so that it can be ready to grab you. So that's why with a lot of people who are addicted to something, there are certain people, places, and things which tend to be more dangerous for them than other people, places, and things. And so the idea is that the crocodile knows those people, places, and things and gets there before you get there to wait for you and ambush you. So I figured out with this client that we would find an eye position, and that's what Brainspotting is about. We find an eye position that correlates to what you feel in your body when you think about something, like when you think about wanting to do sexting. What do you feel in your body? That sort of excitement that comes into your chest, maybe, or something like that. And we find an eye position that helps increase that feeling in the chest. And then I needed to find another eye position that correlated to his consequences, of which he had many, and I won't go into them all. But it affected his work, it affected his marriage, it affected his relationships with his children, it affected his relationships with his recovery community. So he really had a lot of these consequences, which he just could not see were his, which I found fascinating. So I developed this certain way of using Brainspotting where we created what I think is a new like a passageway that goes from these two islands and connects them, a walkway, so that when he's on one island, he can be really aware of the consequences on the other island. And what we found was that just that gave him a huge advantage when he would go into craving or wanting to do this behavior. He was so aware of the consequences that the behavior just lost its reward for him. And I've done this with lots and lots of people with substance abuse, with more behavioral kinds of compulsive behaviors, food disorders, cutting issues. And it seems that what it does, it connects the wanting to do the behavior with the consequences of why they don't want to do the behavior, which gives them this huge advantage.
So going back to what you were sharing earlier about pleasure seeking, if I'm hearing you correctly, it speaks to the idea that when somebody is pleasure seeking and then there's these consequences, the crocodile setup of brain spotting actually helps the brain click into the consequences more readily, and therefore the pleasure seeking diminishes.
It kind of ruins the pleasure seeking for you.
Yeah, it does ruin it.
Yeah.
But I think there's something so powerful about what you're saying, because in general, when it comes to cravings and urges and compulsions, there's something so stubborn sometimes about those things. And yet what I hear you working on with your clients, and I've seen this with my clients as well, is that there's that possibility of somehow you're right, it kind of ruins it. It kind of contaminates that pleasure seeking path. Okay, that's yeah.
Because I think when we're in the pleasure seeking, we're kind of in a trance. You know, when we're walking to the fridge to get that cake, you know, the next piece of cake, we're sort of in a trance. We're not really present in ourselves as we are, you know, 30 minutes after we have the cake. We're much more present. So I think it has the ability to pull us back out of this trance that we go into when we want a reward, but part of us knows it's really unhealthy for us. We just go into this floaty place. You know, some people call it dissociative, but it's kind of like this floaty trance place where you're just, before you know it, your hand's in the fridge and the cake's in your mouth. And then you go, whoa, I wasn't going to eat that. What happened? And so when we do this brain spotting, Crocodile set up to join them together. The minute you have the thought, I want that cake, you also have the thought simultaneously about your blood sugar level. If it's in, you know, like I've done this with people with diabetes. And so really the sugar addiction is really life-threatening. So, but they can instantly see, you know, their last sugar reading in their mind. Or I did it with a client who had a pretty severe cocaine addiction and was in the entertainment industry over there in the US. And one of the things that was his consequence was, and excuse me for the squeamish, but when you do too much cocaine, you can get blood clots that come out of your nose. So that was one of his consequences, was pulling these blood clots out of his nose from having too much cocaine, and feeling that their bone up in between his eyes, the bone was already being eaten away by the cocaine. And so he went to a party and was offered a bowl of cocaine. And when he looked at the bowl of cocaine, the image that came into his head was himself pulling these blood clots out of his nose. And he just went, no, I'm not having that.
Right.
So that gives the person with any compulsive behavior huge advantage, because then you really can sort of say yes or no to it. When you're fully informed in the moment, you can do it, but this is what it's doing to you. You have a better advantage over that crocodile who's sitting there sort of shoving that bowl of cocaine at your face. You can say, you know, no, that's not what I want. I do not want my
Mm.
face collapsing and, not be able to work.
Hmm. I really appreciate the idea of the trance, because what you're saying is the healing arc is getting out of the trance.
Yes.
And if somebody's able, in this example that you gave, to really know on a deeper level that they have the awareness that they don't want those blood clots coming out of their nose anymore, then it really, the trance vanishes, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm a recovering addict and alcoholic myself as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my 35th year clean and
Wow.
sober.
Mm-hmm.
But it really is like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that it's really like, I would say to myself, okay, I'm not going to drink.
Yeah.
I'm not going to drink. And then just one drink. And then two drinks. And then I'd say, oh, I may as well go out now. This is when I was a younger person. I
Mm.
may as well go out now and find some friends and go drinking. And it would always end badly.
Mm-hmm.
But every other day, I would have the idea, I'm not going to drink. Oh, just one drink. Oh, just two drinks. Oh, I may as well go out and find my friends. And it would always end badly. And that went on for 8 years. But see, there was no connection in my brain when I wanted to have that first drink
Right.
to how badly this always ended. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean badly, like raped, beaten, car accidents,
Mm-hmm.
badly. But it's not enough to stop the part of my brain that wants the reward.
Mm-hmm.
And the reward is I had terrible anxiety from a childhood of a lot of disruption and parents who were Holocaust survivors. My mother was mentally ill. My father was pretty much absent, and then they got divorced. So I had a lot of anxiety as a child that I did not have any way to manage, nor did I have an adult to help me understand what was happening or sit with me or
Mm-hmm.
explain to me what was happening. So I discovered initially that cough medicine, which at the time had a lot of alcohol and codeine in it, really helped me calm down. So
Mm.
this is where what happens in addiction is that people sort of stumble into some kind of behavior or substance or activity that helps their nervous system,
Mm-hmm.
which is too anxious or too depressed
Right.
or too lonely, um, to feel better for a period of time. And
Mm-hmm.
then the brain releases dopamine. So people may have heard of dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
So here's another interesting thing about addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Dopamine in the brain, originally, we would get a big hit of dopamine when we were nomadic people wandering the earth. Our brains would get a big hit of dopamine when we stumbled upon, for example, a lake of fresh water,
Mm.
or like a flock or a herd of wildebeest. So this release of dopamine into the brain tells the brain what you are seeing and doing now has survival value.
Mm.
So that when our tribe comes through here again next spring, we'll have a greater chance of finding this fresh water and this food.
Mm-hmm.
So because we need it for survival. So dopamine tells the brain to file whatever lights it up in the file that says needed for survival.
Mm.
So unfortunately, when we get a reward from any kind of, sex or alcohol or drugs or whatever it is, we get a huge hit of dopamine, which pushes that into the file in the brain labeled necessary for survival.
Wow.
That's a huge problem,
Mm. Mm.
because that's what, when you see what people are willing to do to get their substance or go through with their behavior, the degradation, the horror that people create and
Mm-hmm.
have done to
Mm-hmm.
them, yet compulsively continue to go back and go back and do it again and again.
Mm-hmm.
When I found out this piece of information, then it finally made sense. It's like the brain thinks this is oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
This is the equivalent of oxygen.
Right.
So I will steal, I'll I'll sell myself, I'll do whatever's necessary because my brain thinks if I don't get that alcohol, I'm going to die. And that's what it feels like as an addict. I have to have this or I'm going to die.
Right.
And it's because the brain is reading it incorrectly as necessary for survival. So the brain won't give up something that it considers necessary for survival without some kind of good reason. So in the Crocodile setup, that's why you'll remember, Andrew, that we do the third spot, brain spot,
Yes.
which I developed for this reason. So the brain is not willing to give up a reward or something it considers necessary for survival until it has something of equal or greater value. So I thought, well, we have to give that to the brain. How do we do that? So I ask the person to imagine a time in the future when they are completely free of this behavior, whatever it is. And it's often very difficult for people to imagine that. So we can just put future language, which is, someday, maybe far in the future, there's a possibility that perhaps you could be free. And we just need to find one little cell in your body that thinks that's possible. And usually you can find one little cell. And then we do in brain spotting what we call an expansion, which is we just let that little spot expand so the whole body can start to have the experience. And what happens, people start to get an image of what that looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, what it tastes like there. And then we just let that expand even more. So it really feels like they're there. And
which becomes a resource of sorts.
Yeah. Well, then the person's body feels fabulous. They get a hit of dopamine. It goes into the file that says necessary for survival. And then the body wants that more. That becomes the reward that the brain wants you to have rather than the 6-pack of beer or whatever it was.
Sure.
So there was a therapist who did this with someone who just wanted to do just wanted to limit his drinking to a 6-pack of beer a night, no more. And for whatever reason, she couldn't do the first two that we talked about earlier. So she remembered this one. And so she did this with him. Imagine your life when you're free of this. And he could do that. And he, all these connections, he reconnected in his mind, with children, grandchildren, how amazing it was, how much fun they had. And he said, if the only thing I had to do was not even drink that 6-pack, this would be worth it to me. So his brain found something that went in as a huge hit of dopamine as necessary for survival. And then the drinking the 6-pack became the block to the survival. Right. So then you can't have that 6-pack. You don't want that 6-pack because that will stop me getting what I really want.
Right.
And that all connected in his brain, and he didn't drink anymore. Now, it doesn't happen that quickly for everybody, but there's certainly lots and lots of cases where it does.
Sure.
As you probably know with your clients.
Yeah. I could talk for hours about this with you, Robbie. I wanted to just share that one of the things I love about brain spotting and one of the things I love about the Crocodile setup is that nothing is set in stone, that it's a very flexible model, and we really are the tail of the comet. We are following the client's nervous system and not making any assumptions and sometimes just being creative and going with what seems to be happening in the moment. And I just so appreciate, on so many levels, I so appreciate you and your contributions to the brain spotting community. We have a very active Facebook community for brain spotting and addictions. And all I can say is you're a gem, and I so appreciate you being with us today. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much. It's lovely to see you, even if it's virtually.
Exactly.
Hope to see you soon.
Oh, me too.
Thank you.
Hopefully sooner rather than later. Thank you for listening today. It was an absolute pleasure sharing this time with my super talented colleague and friend, Roby Abeles, and discussing this really significant topic that affects those affected by compulsive sexual behavior. Roby can be reached through her website at brainspottingaustraliapacific.com.au. Be sure to give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, or please share our podcast on Spotify. If there are topics you'd like us to discuss in the future, please let me know. I look forward to you joining us on future podcasts, and thanks again for being with us today.